So today it's our pleasure to introduce to Dr. Anneli Jefferson, who is lecturer in philosophy at Cardiff University. And her main research areas are moral philosophy and philosophy of psychology and psychiatry. Anneli recently published a book on the relationship between mental disorders and brain disorders, mental disorders, brain disorders. And today, Anneli, she will be presenting her recent work entitled "A Rose by Any Other Name Would Smell as Sweet: Objections to the Brain Disorder Label in Psychiatry." Just for all of you who are not familiarized with the format of this webinar, so we are this will be 1 hour session, and in the webinar, Anneli will start with a 40 minutes presentation, and at the end we will have 20 minutes for the Q&A. So you can see in the webinar you have the Q&A. So please write all your questions in the Q&A section, and then I will go through all of them at the end of the session. Okay. Thank you very much for everybody attending, and Anneli, now thank you very much, and this is your turn now. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for having me. I will just get going. So when Juliet first meets Romeo, she is not so happy that that his name is Romeo and that he's from the wrong family. And so we have this very famous line where he says, what's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. And I'm not going to ruin the romance straight away and say, well, basically what we've got here is the claim that for certain things, the name doesn't add anything, the label doesn't add anything to the features that that thing, in this case, the rose, has. But lots of people think that it's very different in psychiatry with diagnostic labels, with psychiatric labels, because they believe that, and rightly, that it makes a difference how we categorize conditions and people who we label with those conditions, and that makes a difference to how these conditions manifest themselves. So what I'm gonna be concerned with in this talk are brain disorder labels. Sometimes you get something similar where you have the functional organic dysfunction distinction in neurology and psychiatry. These kinds of labels are often sought out, so some people want a certain condition to be called a brain disorder. But there's also a lot of people who react against these labels and think that they're in some way or other pernicious. And there's two things I'm going to be interested in this talk. The first is more theoretical, and the other one is still somewhat theoretical because obviously I'm a philosopher. So the first one is what justifies calling a condition a brain disorder? What do we actually mean by that? And when would that be a theoretically justified label to use? And the only reason I'm doing that is because we kind of need to know what we're talking about. For worrying about the more practical worry later on, which is the practical effects of labels. So I will also be interested in how labels, as I will argue, often wrongly influence both the self-perception of people suffering from psychiatric conditions and mental distress, but also the perceptions that others have of them, and consequently also their behavior, their thoughts, and so on and so forth. And I'm going to be drawing heavily on my recently published book, Our Mental Disorders, Brain Disorders, in this talk, but obviously it would be a bit boring if I gave you a whistle-stop tour of the whole book. So the main focus on the labeling effect is from the last bit of the book. Okay, so here's a plan. I'll first introduce the debate about whether mental disorders are brain disorders. Then I'll give some objections against the brain disorder label from what I call the narrow view. And so here's one thing I should say, because I have found when I talk about these matters that people tend to fall very often into one of two more extreme camps. There's some people who really don't like the brain disorder label, and think it's pernicious and theoretically badly supported. And then there's also a lot of people who think, well, yes, of course, mental disorders are brain disorders because the mind wouldn't exist without the brain. All thinking requires brain activity. So it just kind of follows that every mental disorder is a brain disorder. I'm not going to look at that position so much. I'm going to be addressing the worry that it's just wrong to say that a mental disorder is a brain disorder because there's a very specific understanding of brain disorders at stake, which I think is actually an interesting one and in some ways a compelling one. So that's why I'm going to focus on that rather than also talking about people who think any mental disorder is just automatically a brain disorder. Then I'll introduce a more modest understanding of brain disorders, and it's just going to be a very brief sketch. And then I'll come to the worries about labeling effects. So I'll introduce some of the worries about stigma, but also some of the positive reasons people think it might actually be a good idea to call a condition a brain disorder. We see that a lot, for example, in certain areas of the addiction discussion. Then I'll look at some empirical data on labels and stigma if you have brain labels and brain explanations. Then I'll try to explain some possible negative effects and at the same time also try to give some advice as to how we can mitigate those so that they don't arise in quite the same way. And then I will conclude. Okay, so why shouldn't we call the condition a brain disorder? So as I said before, it's a contested label. And it's also used in different ways. I mean, this is why I started with a Shakespeare's quote. I wasn't just trying to be pretentious and make a detour to literature. It is really, in this case, it does matter what we call something, and it tells us something about how people understand the term as well. There are some conditions where we all agree that they're a brain disorder. And if we had a bit sort of a classroom situation, I'd probably ask you to tell me some, but I'm not really able to do that right now. But brain cancer is normally, I haven't yet met anybody who doesn't think that's a brain disease. Then we have Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, though even there things sometimes get a bit difficult. Neurosyphilis is an example that's used a lot as well in the philosophy of psychiatry. So we have these conditions that people agree are conditions that include dysfunction in the brain, and they then either call them brain diseases or brain disorders. I'm just going to use that as, I'm just going to use the disorder label rather than the disease one, because I take that to be more general. But if you prefer brain disease, you can insert that as you see fit. Okay, so what are the objections? Some people say that calling something a brain disorder implies that there is some antecedent, so pre-existing organic dysfunction, which then in turn cause the mental symptoms, and which is the thing that needs to be treated, often with direct intervention on the brain, be that medication, surgery, or something else. And probably the most famous person who had that view of what is a brain disorder is Thus. He then also had a bunch of other commitments because he said, well, you have to be a brain disorder in order to be a disorder if you're a mental disorder. But he didn't think that mental disorders were brain disorders because he had this kind of notion of brain disorder. But you also have much more recent positions which at least lean in that direction. So we've got George Graham, Hannah Picard sometimes says things like that, and I'll be reading a quote later. And we have Denny Boersboom also characterizing the brain disorder view somewhat like that. Okay, so here's Hannah Picard. And there's this lovely quote, which I like because it kind of illustrates the way in which she thinks that brain disorder labels are both incorrect, so not the right labels, but also harmful. So she says, the cost of assuming that mental disorders are always caused by underlying brain pathologies is significant. For it pathologizes a person and their mind by treating their symptoms, which include their emotions, moods, and actions, as mere effects caused by brain disease. So what you see there very clearly is like the bad effects, where we all of a sudden just treat mental symptoms as noise or as effects. But you also slightly more covertly see the notion of brain disorder at play there, because you have the idea that there's a preceding cause, the brain disease, and that then just leads to certain psychological symptoms further down the line. So my response to that is that I think that's too narrow a view of brain dysfunction. And that we should not think of brain dysfunction only as something in conditions where you have some kind of organic failure that precedes mental symptoms. So think of the brain tumor that starts growing, and then you have mental symptoms. An alternative way of thinking of brain dysfunction is to think of it in terms of realization. And when I say alternative, I don't mean we should get rid of the traditional brain disorders. We'll have these, but what I'm saying is we should broaden our definition so that we can also admit to differences in the brain that always occur and that realize a dysfunctional mental process, for example, like dysfunctional fear reaction, where you then have measurable differences in the brain. You can also call that dysfunctional, even if, for an example, in post-traumatic stress disorder, it's clear that the initial cause for that condition was a psychological trauma. So what I'm advocating is that finding dysfunction at the level of the brain is enough to say that there's something wrong in the brain, which means it's also enough that we can call that condition a brain disorder. That means that we don't have to always have this preceding brain dysfunction. And it also means that, and that's also controversial, at least for some people, that we don't necessarily need to be able to say independently of what we found psychologically and what we've then discovered is different in the brain when somebody has these kinds of psychological issues, then we might only say that this difference that we found is a brain dysfunction because of what we found out about how it realizes psychological dysfunction. And I don't think that's terribly out there. In fact, sometimes I think it's really boring, but then I get certain reactions that tell me that maybe it's not quite so boring. But I think that what we see in certain research programs, and in particular what we had in the RDoC, where people try to find domains of functioning and pursue that down to the brain level, that the notion of brain disorder that people like Thomas Insel have in mind when they say that mental disorders are brain disorders is not the notion where you think, oh, they're like brain cancer, or oh, they're like neurosyphilis, but the notion where you say, well, there's something different going on in the brain circuits. They sometimes talk of sort of malfunctioning brain circuits, and that can be treated by therapy. It doesn't have to be treated by medication. So it's a much broader view of brain dysfunction and consequently brain disorder than is proposed by people like Zass, who think that only very few conditions where all the interesting actions at the level of the brain should be called brain disorders. Okay, one caveat is that obviously we have to see what we find. It's possible that the classification of psychological dysfunction doesn't align very well with recognizable patterns at the level of the brain. So this, as a research project, that might still not work, but there's no in principle reason to say it's failed from the outset. Okay, so I'm hoping that that sounds at least not ridiculous to you, because I'm not actually going to do any more to defend it in this talk, but move on to the pragmatic objections. Okay, so I'm just going to list a few. So one we've seen recently is by Carl Hart, who objects to addictions being called brain disorders. And he has some theoretical reasons against this, but he also has more urgent practical reasons against it, because he says that when we call addiction a brain disorder, we start focusing on individual biology and individual psychology and individual brains, and that ignores the important societal factors that explain both why certain people are more likely to get addicted and also why they find it hard to give up on drug use. So he says this whole brain disorder project ignores societal factors, and that means it leads to bad policy. Then a further worry that we have, and we'll see more of that further down the line, is that when we say somebody's got a brain disorder, that others, people who suffer from mental distress, psychiatric illness, so one way in which this manifests in studies is that, for example, people have found there's a higher desire for social distance when people think of people as suffering from a brain disorder. And then this one is particularly interesting for me, the last one, because I work on moral responsibility and moral agency a lot. And so the worry there is more general for agency, not just for moral agency and responsibility, that if you think of something as a brain disorder that undermines your perceived control over that condition, and that can in turn affect behavior in undesirable ways, and it can also negatively affect treatment success. So there's one example which is quite striking, and it's not actually about brain disorders at all, but it's about labeling effects once again. So when in the US, obesity was relabeled as a disease rather than just as being very heavy, there were some studies done, and one is by Hoyt and colleagues from 2014, and they wanted to see how people's behavior and self-perception were affected. And as so often, you don't actually measure behavior directly because you only have the really short snapshot. So what they did is they both asked questions about self-esteem to people who were obese, but also about planned intentions for future eating choices. And it turned out, and this is just one study, so take it with a grain of salt, but what that study reports is that there was a positive effect on self-image and a negative effect on plans for healthy eating in the future. And in terms of the Sattel and Lilienfeld reference that I've given you there, they strongly resist the brain disorder label for addiction, because they say if people think of addiction as a brain disorder, then they just think of it as something you can't do anything about, and that is really bad for treating people with addiction. But funnily enough, especially in the context of addiction, the discussion kind of goes in both directions, because while we have some very strong objections to the brain disorder label from the addiction literature, we also have some of the champions for the brain disorder label in the addiction literature. So you can see when you look at the literature that both clinicians and patients, in fact, and I'll give you an example for that in a bit, are very alive to practical implication of psychiatric labels. So they know and they care. Well, whether they know, I don't. And it's never quite clear to me how much you can know in this area, because these things are in flux so much, and people do have different views. But they certainly have strong views, and they care. So here's Alan Leshner from 1997, from this very seminal paper called "Addiction is a Brain Disease and It Matters." And he gives some theoretical reasons why we should think of addiction as a brain disease, but he also gives some practical ones. And I'll read you the quote. So he says, "The gulf in implications between the bad person view and the chronic illness sufferer view is tremendous. As just one example, there are many people who believe that addicted individuals do not even deserve treatment. This stigma and the underlying moralistic tone is a significant overlay on all decisions that relate to drug use and to drug users. So he's kind of doing the opposite of what I've just introduced you to, where he says, well, if we think of addiction as a brain disease, then that's going to make us more understanding and more compassionate. So it's going to be destigmatizing. He explicitly talks about stigma and that being something he wants to counteract. So we see we have a bit of an iffy situation going on here already, where both sides seem to think that whatever they're doing is going to be better for reducing stigma than the alternative label. Okay, here's some other motivations for adopting the brain disorder label. So one thing you find in certain conditions is that it's considered to be higher prestige if it's seen as a sort of as a physical condition rather than as a more mental one. And probably the most prominent example for that is chronic fatigue syndrome, where there's been a lot of controversy as to how to conceptualize the disorder and whether it should be conceptualized as at least partially psychological, and where there's even lobbying by patient groups against psychological treatment because they want it to be seen as a somatic condition. Okay, and here's the last one, and this is more anecdotal, but it's fairly solid anecdotal, and I'm pretty sure there's literature on it as well, that when people are told that there's differences in the brain and that there's something dysfunctional in the brain in a condition, it helps to manage expectations of the social environment. And you often see that in parent-child interactions. So if you look at treatment advice for anorexia given out to carers, there's a lot of emphasis on changes in the brain, that the brain is dysfunctional in anorexia, and that certain things just cannot be expected of that person, or that certain discussions aren't possible. So you have the appeal to the brain disorder as a way of trying to manage expectations, and you also see that in ADHD sometimes. And there seems to just be something going on that certain behavior gets reclassified when people hear there's a brain difference. And that's both helpful, but also can be quite dangerous. So this is an area that I would like to work more on. And you'll see that I get sort of slightly twitchy when talking about it, because you have this double-edged sword there, where it's on the one hand, pointing to brain difference gives people a way of taking the actual difficulties that the person encounters more seriously. But on the other hand, that can also lead to bad effects in terms of actually taking the psychological level seriously in the first place. Okay, so that leads us kind of to a natural thought, which is, and you can find this in the literature as well, that you have kind of mixed effects from the brain disorder label. You might think it leads to decreased blame, either for having the condition in the first place or for certain behaviors associated with the condition, but also with to decreased belief that the person will be able to recover or manage their condition. And in as far as responsibility judgments rely on perceived lack of control, it kind of makes sense that they would come with a certain amount of pessimism about the individual's ability to manage or improve their situation, at least without external help. So it kind of seems like that's the price of being a bit more compassionate in certain situations. So one way of putting that is that a judgment of reduced responsibility can easily slip into more general worries about not perceiving that person as a full-blown agent. Okay, so that is the overview, and I've given you quite a bit of different views and talking points that various people working in the field make, don't know. But there's also some meta-analyses about labeling effects. And while I would like everybody to just do their research with the concepts and the terms that I need, obviously that doesn't happen. So I'm going to give you some meta-analyses of studies, and they don't exactly fit my problem in the sense that they don't explicitly look at the brain disorder label, but they look at stuff in that ballpark. So that's kind of as much as we've got at this point. So there were 2 meta-analyses on people's associations with biogenetic explanations of mental disorder, which is not quite the same thing. And what people found was decreased blame, increased perception of dangerousness, and desire for social distance. And then more recently, Lohman, I don't know how to pronounce this, and Haslam did a meta-analysis of something that's quite slightly closer, which is associations between neuroscientific explanations of mental disorder and people's reaction to people suffering from these conditions. So what they found was that there's no effect on blame, good or bad. So this purported positive that you found earlier seems to have gone away, at least in that meta-analysis, but that there was greater perceived dangerousness and a greater desire for social distance and more pessimism about the likelihood of recovery. Okay. So what we found so far is that it's a bit of a mess because people argue in both directions, and even the meta-analyses don't kind of always find quite the same thing. There seem to be some negative effects. I'm just going to make this even more puzzling for you, or at least I'll try, by pointing to the following observation. So when we look at addiction, then what we find is that there's quite a lot of agreement about the brain findings in addiction. So people don't disagree on like stuff that's going on in the dopamine receptors and that kind of stuff. I mean, there's a bit of disagreement there as well, but very little. I mean, everybody says there's certain differences. There's some disagreement about whether it's differences in degree or differences in kind. But they still espouse different models of addiction. So one is the brain disease model, and we see Leshner earlier fight that corner. And then one alternative one is the choice model. And this point has been made by Goldberg in a 2020 paper about this weird mismatch between people agreeing on what's happening in the brain, but people not agreeing on what kind of disorder that makes the condition. So if people agree that there are significant changes in the brain in a condition and that these changes underlie psychological symptoms, why do they think the brain disorder or brain disease label itself would be problematic in these kinds of cases or lead to all these tricky consequences that I outlined earlier? So I'm going to give you 2 possible explanations for that, which I think are both at play. I will try to persuade you that one, we should just think better, and the other one, there's also something we can do to alleviate these problematic effects. Okay, so one thing that you find in the literature is that people think, well, one of the reasons why people react so differently when they hear something's a brain disorder is because they're intuitive dualists. So what's an intuitive dualist? Well, it's supposed to be a common feature of our psychology that we're all intuitive dualists. And what that means is that we conceptualize minds and the social world in a completely different way from physical objects and the way they behave. So we have 2 kind of modules of thinking about the world, at least 2, and the one that we use for minds and social interactions is different from the one we use for stones rolling down the hill and all that kind of stuff. And then the idea is that if we give something explanation or description even, that's biological and brain-based and sort of matter-based, if you like, there's a tendency for us to think or act as though that excludes a mentalistic, reasons-based view and explanation of behavior. So basically you're switching modes, and now you're just thinking of it as mechanisms and levers pushing and billiard balls and all those old-fashioned analogies. And if that's true, then the thought would be, if it's a brain disorder, it's kind of like a mechanical defect. And that means that that would be what gives us the explanation for thoughts, emotions, behaviors, and not the reasons that we might have for acting certain ways. I would say that that's clearly not entailed by the view of brain disorders I was suggesting earlier, but that might not matter if we all are kind of psychologically programmed to think that way. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to give like a classic philosophy objection to this way of thinking, which is that if it's true that brain-based explanations erode our notions of agency and responsibility because all of a sudden we don't think the mind is doing anything, then that should be the case across the board. And in fact, there are philosophers who have argued that that's what's going to happen as neuroscience progresses. So I don't know who's familiar with Green and Cohen on neuroscience and free will, but they argue that as we start thinking of behavior as more explainable by brain processes, and as we find out more about how the brain leads to behavior, we're going to lose our belief in people as agents. And they say this precisely because they rely on this intuitive dualism claim. But let's just assume for the sake of argument, and it's only for the sake of argument that we're assuming this, that that's true. In that case, psychiatric disorders don't pose a special problem because we've kind of lost agency altogether. So if intuitive dualism is a problem, it's either a problem for agency across the board, or it isn't a problem. But it's not clear that there's a special case to be made for psychiatry, because if we cannot think of something as being explained by what's happening in the brain without losing the mental side of it, then that's going to be true even if I'm deciding to give a talk here. That was just my brain doing stuff. So I'm not really an agent either. Unfortunately, it doesn't mean I can just clock off and be done now, because I don't actually believe it. So obviously I could respond to this if I were Green and Cohen and say, and this is, I think, a fair enough response, or if I was somebody who didn't like the brain disorder label, and say, well, but we only pay attention to brain explanations in the context of psychiatry. So that's where it's particularly salient. And I think, yes, that's true, but we should still aim for more consistency in our thinking. And we should always look at what exactly is going on in thinking and decision-making in a certain condition, rather than making these general jumps from there's something different in the brain, therefore that person doesn't have agency anymore, doesn't know what they're doing, it's just an effect, and so on and so forth. Doesn't mean that there won't be things that can usefully be said about the what's happening in the brain and how behavior and thinking is affected. But just its general move is theoretically unsound. Okay, I am now going to move to a second explanation for why labeling effects occur in undesirable ways when we have the brain disorder label. And that's that we are too strongly affected by paradigm cases. So the idea is that paradigm brain disorders do undermine our agency in certain respects and are relevantly outside our control in certain effects. And the best way for me to illustrate that for you is to give you a quote by Sattel and Lilienfeld from the addiction brain disease paper. So what they say is that no amount of reward or punishment can alter the course of, say, brain cancer. It is an entirely autonomous biological condition. Imagine threatening to impose a penalty on a brain cancer victim if her vision or speech continued to worsen, or to offer $1 million if she could stay well. It wouldn't matter. So their point is, if we draw an analogy to a paradigmatic case, then automatically there's certain aspects of that paradigmatic case which don't fit the mental health condition that we're concerned with, in this case, addiction. And they're correct in that. It's not the case that you can think yourself out of cancer, but it is the case that you cannot treat addiction without considerable input and agency involvement by the person who is addicted. I just want to say, it's not my topic here because I'm already covering quite a lot of ground, but I would want to stress that the fact that somebody with brain cancer cannot think themselves well doesn't mean that there's no control over action whatsoever. So there's also a danger, even with classic brain disorder, that we discount all agency in ways that aren't justified. But I do take the point that when you're looking at this specific example of treatment and recovery, these paradigm cases are fundamentally different. And if we use them as a model, then we're going to automatically tend to think that somebody who's got a brain condition which isn't cancer might still not be able to do much themselves, even with the help of others, that involves their agency to help themselves recover. So what should we do about this? We can't help but think in analogies. We do it all the time. It's actually quite a useful tool. So I'm not going to suggest that we should stop using analogies in our thinking. That would be a very bad suggestion. I think there's two things that we can and should do. One is we should not forget that they're analogies and not overstretch analogies. And even concerning different paradigmatic brain disorders, we can see that they're quite different from each other. And so we shouldn't sort of be swayed too much by one prominent example. So here's one different condition, which I will call a brain disorder because it also involves problems in the brain, which is stroke. And if you think about the brain damage that you have in stroke, once the acute episode is over, you have a lot of damage often that needs to, where you will then try to rectify or retrain as much of the brain as possible in the recovery process, whether that's learning to walk again, learning to talk again. So in stroke rehabilitation, we have a clear brain problem, but we also have a very strong involvement of agency in trying to improve. And it's a beautiful example in many ways because it shows both how real the problem is, but also the extent to which agency is both still present and also still needed. But obviously, that's not going to be a fitting analogy for every form of mental distress. And other brain disorders, classic brain disorders, might be better comparison cases with other things in other ways. So what we should do is don't forget its analogy, and actually exploring in which ways different might be quite a good way of using the analogy, and broaden our diet of analogies so that we don't become too narrow in our focus. Okay, I'm getting to the end, you will be happy to hear. So I've got 2 more slides where I'm basically just summing up. So in principle, there's at least things we can do to avoid some of the negative effects of the brain disorder label. I'm not saying I've given you a magic bullet, but it's not hopeless, put it like that. There's still the worry whether it's a practically realistic option. If we think that intuitive dualism might be misguided but really hard to overcome. I think we should just try. Then there's one problem which hasn't really gone away, which is this internal tension in the destigmatizing agenda that I introduced when I talked about Alan Leshner and addiction, where he wanted to destigmatize by reconceptualizing addiction as a chronic illness. And there's just intrinsically, I think, a danger that that slips into something that undermines agency, just because it's quite easy to slip from we should be understanding because people are suffering from a chronic medical condition to people are not responsible for their behavior. So the tightrope we have to walk, but I would argue that we have to walk that even if we leave the whole brain label to one side, but it becomes more pressing when we have the brain label, is to acknowledge real difficulties and work with those difficulties. So not just to say people should pull themselves together or something silly like that, but not give up on the idea that there is agency where there's good reasons to think that there is. Okay, and now I'm going to conclude. So what did I argue for? This is for the whole talk. So if we endorse a modest notion of brain dysfunction and disorder, it doesn't follow that the psychological level falls out of the picture the way people were worrying it might in the earlier parts of the talk. It also doesn't follow that treatment always needs to target the brain directly. It can also target it indirectly via talking therapy. Obviously, in some cases, like some of the paradigmatic conditions we are talking about, you will be targeting the brain directly, for example, in brain cancer. There might still be undesirable practical effects of labels and increased stigma. Some of those can be alleviated by more consistent thinking about the mind-brain relationship and drawing on a wider diet of analogies. And some effects, such as taking the condition more seriously and admitting the difficulty the individual faces, are actually desirable, even if they come with this risk that I described earlier on. And that is me out of time and out of text, so I would like to thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Anneli. So this was like a very excellent presentation. And so then now, please, for each of you who are at the audience, please can you write your questions in the Q&A? So far I cannot see any questions yet, but I have as well a few, because I mean, this is at least for me, so this is a very novel topic. So Anneli, I just wanted to ask you a few questions in the meantime that we get more questions from the audience. So my background is in psychology, so in that sense, I was like, so I really enjoy your presentation in the sense that this, of course, is danger of the level of the brain disorder, but because for me, of course, I understand that, and this is one part of the research, the relevance of the brain in the development of mental health problems, but I was never thinking, or at least even before when I was more focusing in the research on mental health problems, that this could be labeled as a brain disorder. So having said this, so which are the professionals or the fields where you find that this label of brain disorders tend to be used more often? So I guess it's maybe more used more by psychiatrists, by GPs. I'm just saying, so like in my background in psychology, so I did not hear that much the label as brain disorder to refer specifically to mental health problems, but so in which fields tend to be more used this term?
I don't think it necessarily divides by discipline. So the people I was citing, and it's complicated by the fact that some people call them brain diseases as well, but from some of the people I was citing, there are philosophers who would go either way. I was giving that, there's a short piece in Psyche by Camilla Nord, who I think is a psychologist or neuroscientist, and she explicitly calls depression in this case a brain disorder. So, then you've got Thomas Insel and some of his colleagues who also pushed that line. And I'm guessing he's a psychiatrist, but I'm not actually 100% sure.
Okay, so then it's like, because I was wondering whether there was kind of a more field. For example, you were saying about neuroscientific, so I was thinking, okay, maybe more in the neuroscience field, but I mean, good to know in that sense that at least from the work that you've been cited, so in fact it has been a bit independently of the field of the researcher in that sense.
Yeah, I think the other thing is that because you might, I have had this as an objection by some people where they say, well, we'd be happy to say there's brain dysfunction involved, but isn't brain disorder or brain disease more of a pragmatic term? And shouldn't we just call anything that that we treat through direct intervention of brain disorder? And does it really matter if we say there's also something wrong with the brain if pragmatically most of the action is at the psychological level? So there's other ways of approaching this where you would have good reasons to draw the lines differently, which I'm sympathetic to, but the reason that I went the way I did was because there was this strong objection by some people to even say that there's something wrong in the brain. And that's why I sort of wanted to, well, what would have to be the case for that to be something that we're justified in saying?
Now we have one question from the Q&A. So this question is from Bennett Munoz. And thanks so much for the great talk. One practical implication of using the brain disorder label that I didn't see you address is the impact on research funding priorities. For instance, I take that one of Insel's motivations in using this label is that it justifies his funneling NIMH research funds towards genetics and neuroscience at the expense of psychological and social studies. I wonder if you have thoughts about this effect of the brain disorder label, which in Einzel's case, I take to have been rather pernicious.
Okay, good. Yes. So one way of thinking about this is to say, well, really, it's a political move calling something a brain disorder, which allows us to give more money to certain sciences, and it's sort of a power play, if you like. I think that's possibly something that has been going on. I would say that the NIMH did fund a lot of stuff that that looks at the purely psychological levels. I do think that there's been a bit of a overstatement of how extreme the consequences of that program that they started has been. I would say in terms of I don't know. I mean, I admit that this is definitely something that's going on for some people, but part of me thinks that if everybody, not that's going to happen, but if everybody endorsed my position, then some of the impetus for that would be taken out, because you wouldn't have the same level of privileging in the brain that you would have if you thought of it in a more Zuss style way, where you think, oh, the brain is the cause and we need to find a brain intervention and so on and so forth. So, I mean, my hope would be, and I do feel that at least Insel was somewhat open to that, that you can actually sort of have a broader church, let's put it like that. Oh, and Matthew, you want to know about
I can read I can read now the question, thanks, Anneli, for your answer. Now, Matthew Broom has a question for you too. So, thanks for a great talk, Anneli. To include the psychological in a brain-based account, how much would you wish to draw on an externalist conception of mind or a more plastic dynamic nervous system? Okay,
so I have a chapter where half of it sort of addresses the question of whether externalism would be a problem for one that's for an account that says mental disorders or brain disorders. And I think it wouldn't be. I think you can go externalist, but there's a few areas there where I still get very confused. Because I don't know how much detail to go into here, because it could be a very long answer. I would say, in principle, yes, I would include externalism. And then the question of the conception of mind and brain as a more plastic, dynamic nervous system. I think both brain, like straight brain research and externalism, are going in that direction more at this point. I don't know. I mean, my one worry about that is not worry. Questions, maybe a better word, is whether once you take into account plasticity, whether you end up. Yes, yeah, exactly. So my thinking about that was that maybe it's going to be very hard to distinguish between bad habits of the brain and dysfunction of the brain, if you like, because you have these, especially in the addiction research, you have these ideas that you suddenly react to certain triggers much more strongly and in ways that are not good for you, but that's something that your brain and you can get over. So I think one thing that's difficult when you go that way is to draw a clear distinction between a difference in function that's harmful and a difference in function that you might, where you say that that's sort of dysfunctional, and I don't know whether you need more theoretical apparatus to address that, because certainly for certain evolutionary accounts, it seems very odd if you can sort of go through a period where you develop certain brain patterns of response and so on and so forth, and certain psychological patterns, and then you get out of those again. Was that like a period of brain dysfunction, or was that just a period of your brain and your psychology going through a rough patch? Or I don't know what the best way to put that is. It seems like the boundary between dysfunction and non-ideal states and processes becomes more fluid, and that's a worry I have. I'm not sure that exactly addresses your problem, your question, or whether that's just something that occurred to me when I saw the question.
I guess Matthew was satisfied with your answer. We don't have any more questions in the Q&A. I was just, maybe to end up then with the webinar, just came to my mind as well another question I wanted to ask you, Anneli. So you're focusing here, of course, in the brain disorders as a label, but have you found as well other kind of other labels that as well have been used in referring to mental health problems that as well might have this kind of a bit dangerous connotation? Like I was thinking when you were talking your presentation, of course, brain disorder is being used because, of course, brain might have a great impact in some mental health problems, and just people, they just narrow the term and say brain disorders. What about, for example, genetic disorders, just only to refer to mental health problems? So, I mean, I was wondering while writing your book or while doing this research, so have you encountered as well other of these kind of labels to refer to mental health problems in addition to brain disorders? It makes sense, my question.
No, I think brain disorders are kind of already so general that yeah, I mean.
So I was thinking sometimes we're talking, I was just suggesting this genetic disorder, not because it's the correct thing, but I was thinking like following maybe a bit similar approach. Like sometimes there is depending on which mental health problem we are talking, there is of course this influence of the environment and the biological factors, but as well the genetic factors, right? So in that sense, maybe some people they want to maybe narrow much one specific topic. So I was just thinking, might be genetic disorder another potential role that you might be writing another book in the future, saying, okay, this is like another label that is used too much maybe in mental health area, that it should not be used in that sense. I was just wondering about that.
Yeah, no, I think if I was going to focus on another label, which I do find interesting, I'd be much more inclined to go narrow rather than broader.
Yeah.
But you do see, and I don't address this in this book at all, but you get things like condition diagnostic labels, which are seen as intrinsically stigmatizing. So you've got psychopathy, which isn't even a DSM label. It's a forensic classification, and you've got borderline personality disorder, which lots of people think is both. As with the brain disorder label, they think there's theoretical problems and they think there's huge practical problems. So I think if you go into specific conditions, you will find a lot of what I was just talking about, so a lot of the similar problems in terms of, is it a theoretically viable label category, and is it a harmful category, and how do these things interrelate? I haven't really thought about it in terms of these very general labels.
Thank you very much. Then I think we are close to 2 p.m. already, so I think this will be the end of the presentation today. Thank you very much, Anneli, again, first for accepting to present in our webinar and for this excellent presentation. So I think we all agree that we really enjoy and learn a lot in this new concept of the labeling that is very important as well when we talk about mental health problems. So thank you very much, and thank you all for attending the IMH Lunchtime Webinar. So there won't be webinars in August because I assume everybody will be mainly on holidays. So we will be back in September. So we will be updating on the website. So thank you very much, everyone. And thanks again, and as well, thank you very much to Stacey for organizing everything. Bye.